first few months following the release of Diablo 4 were yet again another demonstration of the typical life cycle of a game's release and post-release period we so often see in our current climate of modern gaming. And it looks something like this. Stage 1. A company announces an upcoming release of a major IP. Stage 2. The marketing team does stuff. Stage 3. The game is released and the average player count is the highest it probably will ever be. Stage 4. Casuals beat the campaign. They feel like they get their money's worth and either move on or come back every once in a while when they feel like it. This is when player retention starts to wane a bit. Stage 5. Hardcore gamers stay longer and eventually develop a more intimate understanding of the game. These are the players that are more likely to uncover the game's fundamental flaws. Stage 6. Then, if the flaws are egregious enough, mass disappointment ensues, and the flaws appear to be the focus of the discourse. Team Game Bad and Game Good form their alliances. People argue with their favorite streamers about how to fix the game's issues, sometimes even arguing on whether they exist at all. Stage 7. And then, once the dust settles, player feedback is either honored or ignored. This weather cycle, or life cycle of a game, can be observed with almost any release by any well-known company. And it is especially memorable if there are more bad things to say about the release than there are good, because we all know bad news sells. This phenomenon can occur whether it's a full game release, live service update, or even a beta test. And even if an initial content release is mostly successful, players' feelings can still change dynamically over time. The most genuinely passionate players who care about games and their expectations being met by games will always offer their 2 cents on how the experience can be improved for themselves and hopefully for others. Personally, I feel like we see this weather cycle situation play out over and over again, and it has me thinking, how did we get here? How does it affect us? And what should we think about it? And what can we do about it, if anything? So how did we get here? Am I wrong to think that back in the old days, instead of bickering about a game, people either played it or they didn't? Well, people have always been talking about games, but I don't think it has always been this noisy and contentious. Regardless, it at least seems like something has changed in the past 20 years of gaming discourse. So how did we reach an age where gameplay discussions became more common, contentious, and comprehensive? In a word, it's because the internet. Well, there are other more specific reasons, but in my opinion, all of those reasons relate to the internet and its tendency to amplify human behavior. The internet allows us to store and communicate a seemingly infinite amount of information. And because of that, access to digital games is higher than ever before in history. Higher access to games means the average user has more to play. More games to play means more opportunities for users to become familiar with different gameplay mechanics. More experience with game mechanics means the average user develops more opinions on those mechanics. And lastly, more opinions means more online debate and discussion. And on top of all of this, the algorithms of the internet are, understandably, slanted towards what drives the most engagement, aka profit. And again, bad news sells. This can give us the feeling that everybody has a binary opinion, and many people may feel like they should have a binary opinion. And lastly, it may make us feel like we need to know the opinion of others. It's an environment that can make it feel like gaming is getting worse and worse each day, even though there have always been good and bad games. Now, the information age does not always equate to bad news for gaming. So let's move away from the cons of gaming discourse and look at some of the pros. A positive effect that the internet has had on gaming discourse is that it grants players greater access to what we can think of as outgame knowledge. Outgame knowledge is a term we can use to refer to any information about a game that can only be acquired by talking or interacting with other people that play the game. Basically, it's what we can learn from the current state of the discourse surrounding a game, and it answers questions like, how well have others received the game? Do people like it? What issues do people have with the game, if any? What does the player base want the developers to change about the game? And perhaps most importantly, what are the developers doing or not doing in response to feedback? The good thing about today is that you can easily learn these things before buying the game that you're interested in. Back in the day, you found out a game sucked after you bought it, and if it wasn't a live service game, there was zero chance that the game would change for the better. Today, you have streamers and content creators with early access who often play the game live and review it. You also have access to ongoing discussions and Reddit threads for various communities, and even if you disagree with the assessment of a content creator or Redditor, you at least have a better chance of knowing in advance whether you'll enjoy a game today than you would, say, in the 90s when the internet was in its infancy. Now, you might argue that outgame knowledge is not a new feature of the gaming industry, and you would be right. Back in the day, you at least had word of mouth from your buddies, in-store demos at your local Best Buy or GameStop, and you had magazines. However, the issue with magazines is that they function more as an advertisement for the games that companies paid the publication for, a factor that could compromise the value of the information you're paying to get. The critical difference is that today, the internet allows consumers to bypass these roadblocks of the past. Today, you don't have to take the risk of buying what you believe is a bad game. You can just go online and see people talk about it and play it. And sometimes it involves reviews from the most passionate players in a community who spend several hours producing content to help inform the average gamer. Now, you're right to point out that some content creators are sponsored, but that does not always equate to biased reviews. And there's still a variety of perspectives available online regardless, be it through Reddit or even pushback from YouTube comments. This environment often contains different viewpoints, which is likely a more reliable form of information than a single review from a magazine, a commercial, or some other form of corporate-funded advertising designed to hype you up. As long as you remember that not all reviews are created equal, you can gather a more fair perspective by selecting a more extensive collection of views and comparing them to your preferences. This is much easier to do today than it was in the past. And if you like what you see, you want to buy the game, and agree with what other people say about it, you still don't have to leave your house to buy the game. The upside of this is that it is incredibly convenient. The downside is that we often miss out on the ritual experience of driving to the store, pulling the game off the shelf, and holding it in our hand for the first time. As a kid, nothing was more exciting. Now, suppose we reflect further on how the internet impacts gaming. In that case, we can realize it provides us much more than info on what other people think about a game. It also gives players greater access to what we can think of as specific in-game knowledge. In-game knowledge is information that must first come from someone learning that information by playing the game. It can later be documented online as a game guide, for example, but still, it needed to be originally acquired through gameplay. Today, you, in theory, can learn how to navigate the precise mechanics of a game even before you install it on your computer. Let's take old school RuneScape as an extreme example. Its fan-made wiki contains nearly 30,000 articles about its lore, history, and perhaps most importantly, its mechanics. Even if the content is brand new in old school RuneScape, just wait 24 hours. You'll see a guide on YouTube or a fan-made wiki article. You can even watch someone play the content live, in many cases just a few hours after it was released. Name any activity worth doing in old school RuneScape. It will have a wiki guide or a video walkthrough. And to be fair, old school RuneScape probably has the most detailed game wiki of any game wiki in the history of forever. But I don't expect this trend to go in the opposite direction for other games. For example, let's look in the Wayback Machine for the Diablo 4 fandom wiki. You'll find a webpage all the way back from 2019 which contained all the available information for Diablo 4 at the time, years before the game was released. Now, this isn't necessarily evidence that there are guides for every activity in Diablo 4 like there is in old school RuneScape, but still, it does illustrate that, for better or for worse, people are eager to collect any crumb of information the moment it becomes public, and the information age is here to stay. So, what are the implications of this? Is this aspect of the information age a negative or positive for gamers? Well, thinking about this gets complicated, especially if you choose to make it complicated. So, let's make it complicated and explore a few different scenarios. For our first scenario, we'll think about the new player demographic and how the abundance of information like game guides may affect them. If you're new to a game, then having easy access to information can make it easier for you to learn to play. But it might also feel strange to spend half of the time reading a wiki on a phone, a separate window, or another monitor while playing for the first time. Doing so could potentially ruin your ability to be immersed in the digital world and experience novel discoveries in the game. Now, Whether or not people feel the need to constantly read guides for a game depends mainly on two factors: the lifestyle of the player and the accessibility or design of the game. Let's suppose that the vast majority of a player base is constantly using a wiki guide for a particular game. This case may illustrate a point about the game's design more so than it illustrates a point about its player base. This might suggest that the game is not as accessible as it could be, with some design changes that would primarily benefit newer and busier players. Speaking of busy players, let's talk about them. As a busy player, easy access to detailed in-game information can be a substantial positive, especially if you're playing a more grindy game with a lower level of accessibility. Say you're a parent, a college student, or you work full-time. You're not going to have much free time to play, so any piece of info you can gather on a game that helps you progress quicker is a great way to make that 30 minutes you have to yourself per week really count, especially if you're playing an MMORPG that provides hundreds, if not thousands of hours of content. As a busy player, you might not want to aimlessly roam around to figure out what to do. And now that we've mentioned it, let's think more about MMOs. How has the information age affected them? It gets even more complicated for online games, especially when comparing the past to the present. Look at your average MMO 15 or so years ago, before the internet matured. If you wanted to figure out how to do something, you either needed to just figure it out yourself, buy a printed game guide, assuming it existed for the game you were playing, or, more commonly, ask other players for help. Back then, in-game knowledge and guides were not as common or accessible, and therefore group collaboration was often more essential for players to complete much of the available content. This environment was a great way to make friends, and it also encouraged a sense of community within the game. But it could also be a bad thing, because eventually you would run into ChadGamer69. And one time you asked ChadGamer69 for help, and he agreed to help you, telling you that he needs to trim your armor for you to complete the cook's assistant quest. So you traded over all your gear and armor, and then you never saw ChadGamer69 again. Then, if you wanted to look online for help before the peak information age, you first had to make sure nobody else in your family was using the home phone because you had dial-up. Then, once you got online and did your search, you would find a bunch of guides written by people like you, aka 5th graders, and therefore all the guides contained inaccurate information. And the rest of the guides were MMORPG secrets and cheats. Then you, being 10 years old, thinking you're going to get your first pair of dragon plate legs or something, enter your username and password into some phishing site, and then poof, your account is gone. Sit down, little Timmy. So you see, the situation back then was good in that the environment encouraged more player interaction. But it was also bad because it encouraged more player interaction, which came with other potential roadblocks. Now, I'm not implying that scams don't still happen both in and outside MMOs. They might occur more often between players and involve more sophisticated schemes today. Sometimes the devs are the ones that end up scamming the players. On the bright side, it's much easier to hear about these schemes these days. And if you have a lot of experience navigating the internet, you shouldn't fall for them. Let's talk more about MMOs today. Today, the information age can give MMORPGs the opposite problem. So sometimes when you ask for help from others, they will either ignore you because they have their chat turned off and are watching Game Music Historian on the other screen, or they will say, just look up a guide, bro, which is an attitude that could potentially alienate players from each other. But at the same time, if you're pestering another player with an overwhelming amount of questions, look up a guide, bro, could be a fair answer. And in all reality, players that want to make their hours spent on a game as efficient as possible will benefit from guides, especially if that's how they enjoy playing. So let's face it, modern game guides and wikis are more accessible, more detailed, and more accurate than ever before. You can instantly get the info you need rather than waiting for some rando in zone chat to explain it to you. Plus, being more knowledgeable about a game you play can help you keep an eye out for scams and scammers. So guides and wikis would never, and probably should never, disappear. So, we've laid out a few ways in which the internet has impacted modern gaming, both positive and negative. Still, we could discuss so many other avenues that it can become overwhelming, and so at some point we need to think about how we navigate this space. And the best solutions in life are the simple ones. Figure out how you prefer to enjoy playing games, and do that. If you're tired of all the noisy discourse on games and gaming, take a break from it, and try to figure out how you feel about a game without any external input or opinions. If you don't care and like to watch people debate gaming, great, you can still enjoy your game and enjoy the discourse. If you feel like game guides spoil your fun, don't feel pressured to use them. Take all the time you want. And if you're a busy mom, dad, or college student, game guides might be your best friend. At the end of the day, this is the only part of gaming you have control over. And yes, developers should know their audience and improve their games accordingly. But the problem is, not everybody will see such changes as an improvement, and there will always be some pushback. And also, the devs might not even care about your feedback. You can always share your thoughts on a game with developers, and you should, but at the end of the day, you, as an individual, can only control the games you play and the way you play them. As for myself, I like to take my time when I start a new game. If the game is story-driven, I try to get immersed in the plot as best as I can, because personally, that is what I remember most about the game, especially as time passes. I focus on my path towards fun. If I have the most fun figuring out things as I go, aimlessly exploring in the most inefficient way possible, I do that. And if that no longer feels fun, I change my approach. This is when I might look up a guide or two and ask my pals from my guild for help with a specific goal. At the same time, I try to avoid getting too hung up with the goals themselves because the path towards the goal, for me, is almost always more fun than actually seeing the goal done. I'll try my best to use the guides without spoiling the future experiences that are coming, and if the game I'm playing changes and no longer satisfies me, I stop playing. Now, I'm not saying you need to enjoy games the same way I do. I'm just trying to start a dialogue on how we as consumers reflect on the way that we, gamers, engage with media. Now, something that I do strongly recommend is that we avoid having an emotional attachment to the games themselves. Instead, we should be attached to the memories that those games help create, and remember that the time we enjoyed playing was well spent. And if the game changed for the worse in your view, you had your fun, but you're not anymore. And even when that happens, the good memories will always be there. There will always be another game you can play, and there will always be new memories to be made. And every once in a while, the next masterpiece of a game will come out, and you'll be able to enjoy it, whatever it looks like. Yes, it can be disappointing, especially if that game is part of a series you have so many fond memories of. But the most Chad Gamer 69 thing you can do is move on.